It was an ordinary day that began like any other in the quiet town of Fairview. Nestled among gentle rolling hills and endless fields, Fairview was the kind of town where everybody seemed to know everyone else's business. Yet behind polite smiles and friendly greetings, there were silent battles, struggles people carried quietly, without ever asking for help. The cold wind that swept down the empty streets that evening whispered tales of hardship that few spoke aloud. Inside Rosie's diner, a place that had served generations of Fairview's hardworking folks, a man named Thomas sat alone in a corner booth. He was in his early 50s, though his face appeared older from the weight of years spent laboring under the sun. His hands were rough and calloused, a testament to decades of honest work on his modest farm at the edge of town. His jacket was faded, and his boots had long lost their shine. Yet there was a quiet dignity about Thomas that made people respect him, even if they didn't quite understand him. As Thomas slowly sipped his lukewarm coffee, he stared out the window, watching the sun set behind the hills. It was one of those evenings where everything seemed still, almost like the world had paused to catch its breath. That's when he noticed something, or rather, someone, just outside the diner's foggy glass. A young boy stood there, no older than 10. His clothes were thin and torn, his shoes barely held together by frayed laces. His face was pale, his cheeks hollow by hunger. The boy's eyes, however, were what caught Thomas's attention. They were wide and filled with longing, fixed on the plates of food inside the diner, as if they were treasures behind glass. Thomas recognized that look immediately. He'd worn it once, many years ago when his father's crops had failed and there had been nothing but hope for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He set his coffee cup down, stood up slowly, and motioned for the boy to come inside. The boy hesitated, his small fingers tightening around the straps of a worn backpack slung over his shoulder. But after a moment, he shuffled inside. His steps were tentative, as if afraid someone might scold him or send him away. Thomas greeted him with a warm smile and motioned toward the empty seat across from him. "Go ahead and sit down," Thomas said gently. The boy did as he was told, keeping his gaze lowered. Thomas flagged down Rosie, the middle-aged waitress who'd worked there since he was a kid. "Get him whatever he wants," Thomas told her, "and make it hot." Rosie raised an eyebrow, but nodded. She returned moments later with a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a tall glass of milk. The boy's hands trembled as he picked up the spoon, but once he took the first bite, he devoured the meal like someone who hadn't eaten properly in days. Thomas said nothing. He didn't ask for the boy's story. He didn't need to. After the boy finished, he glanced up at Thomas with wide, grateful eyes. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "Thank you, sir. I won't forget this." Thomas smiled softly, shaking his head. "Don't worry about it, son. Just take care of yourself." He thought that would be the end of it. A fleeting moment of kindness, like hundreds of others that quietly pass through a person's life. But he was wrong. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. 40 years later, the years passed, as they always do, swift and steady, without pause or mercy. Thomas's hair turned from brown to gray, then to white. His steps became slower, his back stooped. Yet he worked his farm every day, rain or shine. His farm was small, but enough to keep him busy. It wasn't much, but it was his. One morning, as Thomas was tending to his garden behind the house, he heard a sound that didn't belong. A low rumble, growing louder, vibrating through the ground beneath his boots. He stood up, shielding his eyes against the sunlight. What he saw next made him drop his trowel. A sleek, silver private jet was descending from the sky. It roared over the treetops and, impossibly, landed smoothly right in the middle of his wide, empty field. Thomas stared, dumbfounded. His land had never seen anything fancier than an old tractor, and now here was a machine that looked like it belonged to a billionaire. The engines powered down, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Thomas's heart pounded as he took cautious steps toward the aircraft. He had no idea who was inside or why they had landed there, of all places. Then the door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive tailored suit. His shoes gleamed, and his tie looked like it cost more than Thomas earned in a month. He wore sunglasses, but when he took them off and smiled, something about his face stirred a memory in Thomas's mind. It was the kind of memory that feels distant and close at the same time. "Mr. Thomas Carver?" the man asked. Thomas nodded slowly, unsure what to say. The man extended his hand, his grip firm. Then he said something that made Thomas's knees feel weak. "I told you I wouldn't forget." Thomas stared at him. Slowly, the realization dawned on him. "You're the boy from the diner?" he asked, disbelief thick in his voice. The man nodded, his eyes glistening. "My name is Daniel Rivers now. But yes, I was that boy. A life repaid." Thomas felt like the world was spinning. He had thought of that boy from time to time over the years, wondering what had become of him. But he had never imagined this. Daniel gestured behind him. More people were stepping out of the jet. A young woman in a crisp suit holding a briefcase. And then an elderly woman, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, her movements slow but purposeful. When she saw Thomas, her eyes filled with tears. She walked toward him, each step trembling, and when she reached him, she placed a hand gently on his cheek. "You're the man who fed my son when no one else would," she whispered. Thomas's throat tightened. I just bought him a meal," he said, still struggling to grasp what was happening. Daniel smiled softly. "It was never just a meal, Mr. Carver. That night, you didn't just fill my stomach. You filled my heart with hope." He went on to explain what had happened after that night. His mother had found work cleaning houses while he studied as hard as he could. He won scholarships, started a small business, and over time, built an empire. Now, Daniel Rivers was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, known for his charitable foundations and investments in communities like Fairview. Thomas listened, speechless. Then Daniel opened the briefcase his assistant had brought. Inside were legal documents, keys, and stacks of cash. "This is for you," Daniel said. "A new house, enough money to live comfortably, and the deed to your farm, free and clear. No more debt." Thomas's hands trembled as he touched the papers. His voice was hoarse. "I don't deserve this." Daniel shook his head. "You deserve more than this. But this is a start." Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the family standing before him. He had spent his entire life thinking he was just an ordinary man. But to them, he was something else entirely. He was the man who had restored their faith in humanity. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Thomas's life transformed. Daniel had the old farmhouse renovated, adding modern comforts while keeping its rustic charm. New equipment arrived for the farm, and Thomas no longer had to struggle through his days. But more than the material gifts, it was the friendship that blossomed between him and Daniel's family that mattered most. Every Sunday, they gathered at Thomas's table for dinner, sharing laughter and stories. The farm was once again filled with life and purpose, a place of joy rather than quiet solitude. And Thomas never forgot the lesson that small acts of kindness, no matter how simple, could echo across decades, changing lives in ways no one could predict. Moral of the story: sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion spark a chain reaction that transforms lives in ways we never expect. A simple meal shared in kindness turned into a legacy that spanned generations. So, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales. And tell us in the comments, has a moment of kindness ever changed your life? We'd love to hear your story. Welcome to TAL, stories that remind us kindness never goes unnoticed. And sometimes it flies back into your life on a private jet.